I'm Dr. Joe Sprinkle, and this will be a short lecture on Psalm 126. We'll read it out of the English Standard Version, a Song of Ascent. When the Lord restored the fortunes of Zion, we were like those who dream. Then our mouth was filled with laughter, our tongue with shouts of joy. Then they said among the nations, the Lord has done great things for them. The Lord has done great things for us. We are glad. Restore our fortunes, O Lord, like streams in the Negev. Those who sow in tears shall reap with shouts of joy. He who goes out weeping, bearing the seed for sowing, shall come home with shouts of joy, bringing his sheaves with him. Structure of the psalm divides up into two parts. One is the joy of restoration, and then a prayer for restoration. 1 through 3, joy of restoration, verses 4 through 6, a prayer for restoration. Now, there is a preliminary problem of translation that we need to mention, and the problem has to do with how the tenses of verses 1 through 3 should be understood and translated. That is, should it be understood as referring to the past tense, or should it be referring to the future? If you take it as past tense, which is the way the English Standard Version takes it, is talking about what has already happened. When the Lord returned the captivity of Zion, or when the Lord restored the fortunes of Zion, we were full of joy. And it's talking about something that happened in the past. But then the prayer in the next part, in verses 4 through 6, then would be asking God to do it again. What you did in the past, we'd like for you to do it again. Anyway, the New American Standard, the New Revised Standard, and many other translations take it all as past tense. But it is possible to take verses 1 through 3 as future. The New Jewish Publication Society translation, sometimes called Tanakh, renders everything as present future. When the Lord restores the fortunes of Zion, our mouths shall be filled with laughter, and so on and so forth. And that would make it what's going to happen in the future that then you pray to God would happen. Now, part of the problem here has to do with the nature of Hebrew language. Hebrew forms have no tense. But there's one type of form called the perfect that tends to refer to completed action. There's another form called an imperfect that tends to refer to incomplete action. And most of the time, perfects would be translated past tense. Most of the time, imperfects would be translated future. But you can have the perfects translated future and the imperfects translated past. The time aspect actually comes from the context, as it turns out. It doesn't have tenses in quite the way that English does. Now, if you take the future interpretation, you must take the perfects that are in the verse 3, for example. The Lord has done great things for us, and we rejoiced. As referring to the future. That's called a perfect of future reference by the grammarians, or in a popular way called prophetic perfects, where it's you speak of something in the past that's going to happen in the future to express certainty that it will happen. And so you could take it that way and make those perfects into an imperfect and have to do with the future. On the other hand, if you take the past interpretation, there are some um, verbs that are in the imperfect, which are normally translated future, that you'd have to take as continuous action in the past. And so you translate verse 2 that our mouths were full of laughter over a period of time, would be the idea. And that's the view that I'm going to adopt, and that's the view that the English Standard Version adopted. That seems to make the most sense of the passage, though I have to admit that the future interpretation is grammatically possible. Now, regardless of how you do verses 1 through 3, verses 4 through 6 has got to be talking about the future, because it doesn't use either perfect or imperfect forms, but imperative forms, calling on God to do something in the future. And thus it demands a future application, whereas 1 through 3 could be past. I think the best way to look at it is 1 through 3 is talking about what's already happened in the past. Verses 4 through 6 is asking God to do something similar again in the future. So it begins with a look to the past, a past scene of deliverance. How happy they were when God restored their fortunes. It was like a dream come true, full of joy and laughter. And even the Gentiles could look on and see how God had helped the Jews. And the fulfillment of this is perhaps a reference to what happened after 539 BC, when King Cyrus of Persia, whose tomb is pictured here, when King Cyrus of Persia conquered Babylon, and shortly thereafter allowed Jews to begin to return from exile to rebuild the temple. And the ones that returned, well, some came back under Zerubbabel, some came back later under Ezra, some came back later under Nehemiah. There were different periods of return, but when they came back, they were so full of joy that God had restored the fortunes of Zion. And I think that's probably the reference that's being made here. Now, there is a little bit of a discussion as to how to translate that one line. Is it that the Lord restored the fortunes of Zion, so the New Revised Standard Version, or that the Lord brought back the captive ones of Zion, New American Standard Bible? And it hinges on identifying the verbal root of the noun that's used in verse 1 and verse 4. The noun is shibat in verse 1 and shubah in verse 4. If that root is from shuv, return, then what we have is a idiom, literally to return the returnings of Zion, which as an idiom means to restore the fortunes of Zion, or in this case, simply restore Zion. So the Hebrew and Aramaic lexicon of the Old Testament interprets it. So as we saw the New Revised Standard Version interprets it as from that root shuv. On the other hand, if it's from the root shabah, which means to take captive, then it would mean to return the captivity of, or the captive ones of Zion. And that's how the New American Standard renders it. That said, most recent lexicographers have taken it as that idiom, restore the fortunes of, and therefore from the root shuv, for return the returnings of, in the idiomatic sense of restoring the fortunes of. And this would certainly include return from captivity, but it would not be strictly limited to captives. And I'm going to adopt the view of modern lexicographers here, that is restoring the fortunes of. So you have the joy of God's having restored their fortunes in verses 1 through 3, but then verses 4 through 6 is a prayer to restore the fortunes. Restore our fortunes, O Lord, like streams in the Negev. Those who sow in tears shall reap with shouts of joy. He who goes out weeping, bearing the seed for sowing, shall come home with shouts of joy, bringing his sheaves with him. Whatever the past deliverance was, there's a need now for a future one for all God's promises to be fulfilled. And the sense is, well, you've done it once, Lord, verses 1-3. Please do it again, Lord, verses 4-6. If that were to happen, it would be like streams in the south or streams in the Negev. The Negev was and is the arid region in the south of Israel, where streams are mostly wadis, that they're rivers that dry up in the summertime, but are renewed when the former rains begin in the spring on into the early fall. And so they can go from being a dry creek bed to a torrent with a flash flood in a very, very short time. And if God were to restore the fortunes, it would be like restoring the streams in the south, suddenly going from empty to full. And so God is asking, the psalmist is asking God to do something like that for them, to fill us up again. Because right now we're dry and desolate, and we need your help. Verses 5 and 6 could be a statement of confidence. Those that sow in tears will reap in joy, and so on and so forth. That could be a statement of confidence and making a statement for the future, or it could be a wish. May those who sow in tears reap with shouts of joy. Again, the tenses in Hebrew are a little bit shaky in that you can't tell the difference between a prediction of the future and a wish. They're the same, or at least very often they're the same form in Hebrew. The New Revised Standard Version made it a wish. May those who sow in tears reap with shouts of joy, and that would make it a part of the prayer, that Lord, restore our fortunes. And if that happens, we don't know for sure if or when it will, well then the joy will follow the tears as described here. I find the wish prayer interpretation of the New Revised Standard Version attractive here. So nonetheless, it's slightly more likely a statement of confidence, but is the Psalms do typically end with a statement of confidence towards the end, but it could also be a wish. It's only slightly that I lean towards the traditional prediction rendering. So those that sow in tears will reap with shouts of joy. Those that go out weeping will come home with shouts of joy, bringing sheaves with them. And the main point is, though difficult times and hard work lies ahead, there will be good reward in the future, and we're to live in that hope. So how are we to apply a psalm like Psalm 126? Well, it's a reminder that hard times are only temporary. Eventually, God is going to restore his people's fortunes. We may have long periods of drought and hardship, but God loves his people, and he's going to restore our fortunes sooner or later, if not in this life, in the age to come. And so look forward to that. Hard times are only temporary for God's people. Secondly, seeing how God worked in the past can give us confidence as we pray for the future. The writer of Psalm 126, look to the past. God restored their fortunes, and use that as a basis for praying in the future. And as Kidner notes in his commentary, We can do the same in the church. We can look at records, for example, in the past when God sent a revival in the land. And there's been various periods of revival that have happened. And that can give us the courage to pray for revival now, even though we feel spiritually as a country like a dried up creek bed and not much spiritual activity going on. What is currently a dried up wadi can become a swollen torrent if we continue to look to God for his blessing. And that is an encouragement to keep on working despite discouragements. Again, the imagery of toil sowing followed by the joy of reaping should encourage us. We will eventually reap if we do not give up on doing God's work. The New Testament picks up on that idea in Galatians 6 and verse 9. Let us not become weary of doing good, for at the proper time we will reap a harvest if we do not give up. What is the genre of Psalm 126? It's not real obvious at first because it seems to be praise and joy for the fact that God had delivered them and restored their fortune. So the first part kind of looks like a song of thanksgiving. But the last part is a prayer that God restore their fortunes. And that last part being a prayer to restore their fortunes means in context that their fortunes are not doing quite so well right now. And so it looks like that this psalm is actually a lament. More specifically, it's a community lament. It prays on behalf of the whole community, beseeching God to do again something that he has done before, to restore our fortunes. Now that completes my analysis of Psalm 126, but I'm going to use this as an occasion to mention about something about how Hebrew Psalms could be sung. And the reason I bring this up is because Psalm 126 is sung commonly in Judaism as, particularly on Shabbat or Sabbath, as a prayer after meal. And when I was at Hebrew Union College, they would have a prayer after meal, and it would last for actually some considerable amount of time. And included in that prayer after meal, they would sing in Hebrew Psalm 126. And people wonder, well, how could these psalms be sung? We don't have melodies of how they were sung. But they certainly could be, and I can't say that the melody that's used today may have any relationship with the ancient melody, but it is at least a reminder that these songs were sung originally. And for my own time's sake, I would like to attempt this, and for those of you who are Hebrews, pardon me if I butcher it a bit. Shir amalot bashuv Adonai et shivat zion hayinu kacholmim az yamale sohokpinu ulsholnenu rina az yomru bahagoyim hig Higdil Adonai lahasodim eleh, Higdil Adonai lahasodim anu, Hayinu samechim. Shubad Adonai et shivitenu, Kafikim ba'negev, Hazorim Bahadima Baharina Yiksoru Halok Yelek Ubakol No Se Meshek Hazara Bo Yahvo Barina, no se alumotav. And that's how Psalm 126 is sung by certain Jews today. And that completes my analysis of Psalm 126. And I am Dr. Joe Sprinkle.